This is a continuation of the reading of the book by Richard Hoskins called War Cycles, Peace Cycles. As this content is related to the broader scope of understanding macro and geopolitics, I felt this to be appropriate to include as part of the Interchain FM podcast. Enjoy. Khazaria's new rulers. The nation of Khazaria was no more. The Khazar Jewish converts remained. Most continued to live beside the great Russian rivers as they had done for hundreds of years. They formed tight, suspicious, autonomous groups who looked in upon themselves and excluded the world. They wanted to be left strictly alone, and that was the one thing their Christian, Mohammedan, and Mongol conquerors would not do. From 884 to 1016, the Russians conquered these porcupine-like enclaves, scattering Jewish refugees across Europe and into Spain. Then the Mongols stormed through in 2040, a cataclysmic event that pushed another wave of Jews into Europe. This last wave of dark-skinned, Yiddish-speaking alien invaders caused a reaction. Starting with England in 1290, the Jews were expelled from Europe and herded back to the east, again to join their brothers in what was by now Poland. But there was no peace for these people without a country. In time, the Polish rulers were displaced by Russian overlords. Next came the Mohammedans once more, the Mongols, then the Hungarians, Australians, Germans, and again, the Russians. Most Khazarian settlements tended to remain generally where they had always been, while the ebb and flow of war brought new masters and new national boundaries every few years. In the 9th century, a Sephardic Jew scholar in Cordova, Spain, Hasdai ibn Shaprut, heard of a Jewish national homeland in Khazaria. He wrote King Joseph to ask about it, especially to learn to which of the tribes the monarch belonged. The answer came back. "We have found in the family registers of our fathers that Togarma had 10 sons, and the names of their offsprings are as follows: Uyghur, Dersu, Avars, Huns, Basili, Tarniak, Khazar, Zagora, Bulgars, Sabir. We are the son of Khazar, the 7th. Webster's New World Dictionary defines Ashkenazim, a German Jew, earlier a German, after Ashkenaz, second son of Gomer, distinguished from the Sephardim. Jewish books are very careful to distinguish between Sephardic and Ashkenazic. Most individual Jews would like to claim descent from Spain, for that is where the Khazarian royal family migrated in 1016. The Ashkenazic Jews adopted the 6-sided Star of David as their symbol. This differentiated them from the large settlement of Spanish and Portuguese Jews who called themselves Sephardic Jews. They had adopted for their insignia the Lion of David with his foot on a ball. Certain Christians and all Islamic conquerors of the Ashkenazics in Eastern Europe tried to convert them to their respective religions. Being crude in their approach, the offer was often the simple choice of conversion or being sliced in two with a sword. This was a painful choice. Rabbis came to the rescue by resurrecting an ancient prayer which could be made in advance and would allow the Jews to repeat the Christian, Islamic, or any other oath without actually doing so. It is called the Kol Nidar prayer, and from the earliest times down to the present is made each year on the Day of Atonement. It goes as follows: all vows, obligations, oaths, anathemas, which we may vow, or swear, or pledge, or whereby we may be bound, from this Day of Atonement unto the next, we do repent. May they be deemed absolved, forgiven, annulled, and void, and made of no effect. They shall not bind us, nor have power over us. The vows shall not be reckoned vows. The obligations shall not be obligatory, nor the oaths be oaths. This all vows prayer allowed the persecuted Jews to take any oath they felt necessary, with impunity. This was the thing which allowed the enclaves of Jews to remain together through the years without being destroyed. It has proved indispensable in their negotiations with unfriendly neighbors, as we shall soon see. Khmelnytsky massacres in Poland. Khmelnytsky was an Eastern Orthodox Pole who fought with the Cossacks against Poland, which was Roman Catholic. In those days, Poland was the largest country in Europe. Her borders extended from near the Baltic almost to the Black Sea, while Islam was carving out a European empire and knocking on the doors of Vienna. The Christians, Eastern Orthodox, Roman Catholic, and Protestant were butchering each other in war after war. Khmelnytsky captured Kiev and indiscriminately massacred Jews and Roman Catholics whom he felt to be equally reprehensible. This massacre triggered a chain reaction in Eastern Europe in 1648 to 1649, which again sent thousands of Jews swarming into Western Europe. It was pressure from these new Polish arrivals which gave urgency to Ben Israel's 1655 petition to Oliver Cromwell for them to enter England. The nation of Russia existed to the east of the great country of Poland. Following the example of the other Christian nations, on December 2nd, 1742, all Jews were expelled from Russia by order of Tsarina Elizabeth Petrovna. Russia takes over. Poland was partitioned from 1772 to 1795 by Russia, Prussia, and Austria. In these divisions of Poland, Russia inherited all the Ashkenazi Jews which had previously been expelled from Russia, plus more than 1 million others. The ruling Tsar of Russia at the time was Alexander I. At first, he looked on the Jews as a people like any other people. At this time, Alexander, in common with most other Russians, frankly did not know what a Jew was. In time, he discovered that for ages they had lived in Kahilas, had autonomous rights, and had their own school system called Heters. In spite of not having a separate country, they were in fact a separate nation requiring special treatment. On February 26, 1785, the inhabitants in the newly annexed Polish territory were given all the rights and privileges of other Russian subjects, without distinction of faith or nationality. Immediately, the Russian rulers were inundated with petitions from the Polish Slavs requesting that they be protected from the Jews. This was noticed that the Russians had another problem of which they were not previously aware. At the request of the Poles, all the old Polish restrictions against the Jews were gradually reinstated. The Russians soon found that these Ashkenazic Jews had a well-developed nation existing within the boundaries of Russia. While the Russian government was supremely political, the Jews had their own government administered from their synagogues, their own religion, their own laws, and their own system of finance in which the forbidden practice of usury was the cornerstone. They also discovered that the Poles looked on the Jews as a nation of bankers. In dealing with their own kind, the Jews had a system of building and loans which made money available to any of their number who needed money. Sometimes these loans were made interest-free. At other times, the loans were made at rates between 9 and 12%, rates considered very high at the time. Jewish private schools were everywhere. Their unofficial governments had lobbies to influence first the Polish and later the Russian government. Alexander was advised by his Christian priests to kill or banish these heathen. Alexander flatly refused to kill them, and since no country wanted them, he couldn't banish them. A Russification program was undertaken. The Orthodox Jews put up a stone-wall resistance to the Russians, as they had earlier to the Poles. In 1804, the Russification program was softened, and new laws were enacted which provided for separate Jewish schools which were required to teach Russian. Even these new softened requirements were resisted. The news of these disagreements between the Ashkenazic Polish Jews and the Russians reached the ears of Napoleon. In 1806, on July 19th, at the Hôtel de Ville in Paris, an assembly of Jewish notables was held at the command of Emperor Napoleon. Napoleon wished to use the Jews for his own ends, but first he had to soften the harsh criticism of Jews by devout Christians. They were asked such questions as, does the Jewish law permit the taking of usury from Jews? From Christians? The answer was no. Usury, whether to Jews or Christians, was forbidden by Jewish law. This meeting was a prelude to bigger things next year. Napoleon had, in essence, assured the Christians of Europe that the Ashkenazic Jews were a people just like any other people, and to the accompaniment of much publicity, he proceeded to give them rights and privileges not duplicated elsewhere until 160 years later. For instance, it had been assumed by Western Europeans that Jews would lie if given an opportunity, and so a special Jewish oath, more Judaico, was administered. This oath was abolished in all countries under French control. Jews also could resume using Hebrew and Yiddish in their bookkeeping and also hold public office. French agents in Russia made sure that the Jewish population there was made well aware that a friend and his army were on the way and that they could expect the same privileges as their kinsmen in the French Empire if they would join in with a revolt against the Tsar. The idea of using Ashkenazic Jews for his own ends was well conceived and carried out with all the efficiency with which Napoleon's empire was noted. But it was a dud. The Russian Jews did as they always did when a new conqueror came. Nothing. They were not careless about getting involved in a war where Christians were killing Christians. This betrayal and the Russian cold destroyed Napoleon. He had lifted the Christian church's age-old restrictions against the Jews for nothing, and now there was nothing to contain them, since the Christian church had been virtually eliminated by the French Revolution's terror. They were out of the box. Their first major move was to expand their usury banking, a thing permitted by their religion. Russia's Jewish solution. To have an understanding of Russia's Jewish problem, one must carefully study the map on the following page, copied from a map in the Jewish Encyclopedia, Volume 10, 1909, under Russia. This area of Russia from near the Black Sea almost to the Baltic Sea constitutes the Pale, the modern name for the ancient nation of Khazaria. According to the 1897 census, there were 126 million people living in Russia, of whom 5 million, or 4.13%, were Jews. In the Pale, the Jews made up only 11.46% of the total population. This would at first glance seem to be a low population density by ordinary reckoning, but it is believed that the percentage had never been higher in the long history of Khazaria. The non-Jewish inhabitants of the land were descendants of the Slavic serfs of the ancient Khazarian overlords. Almost 94% of all Russian Jews lived in the Pale, only 6% outside. Outside the Pale, the Jews made up less than 0.5% of the population. This is the reason most Russians knew nothing about Jews. Most had never seen one. On the map of the Pale, you will notice the triangle made up of the three cities, Warsaw, Grodno, and Brest-Litovsk. In 1905, the heaviest concentration of Jews resided in this area. They made up about 20% of the population. The former prime minister of the Israeli state, Menachem Wolfowitz Begin, was born in Brest-Litovsk, August 16, 1913. The area from Gomel in the center to Sebastopol to the south had the fewest, from 4 to 5%. This low density was due to the Russian effort to resettle the Jews from this area. Most Ashkenazic Jews living in America came from this area. Cities such as Moscow and St. Petersburg had virtually no Jews at all. Jews mate freely with their host countries. As a consequence, the South Russian Jews tend to be dark-complexioned from a preponderance of Turkish-Mongol blood, while the Polish Jews living in White Russia have fair complexions and eyes combined with a Slavic appearance. The Jews to the west of Warsaw often have a Nordic appearance. Many of these are indistinguishable from Westerners by appearance. One of the special laws reenacted at the request of the Poles prohibited foreign Jews from having right of residence or from buying land in the Pale. This restriction was passed to prevent the unbelievably wealthy Jewish banking families residing in Western countries from buying up and monopolizing all the land in the Pale and excluding non-Jews from living there. The Christian government of Russia had the greatest difficulty dealing with the closely knit bodies of Khazar Jews who reinforced their national identity with a different language and schools. The attempt to break up the groups living in cities failed. When banned from one city like flocks of crows shooed from one forest, they regathered in the next. They formed new kahela, or local government, colonies in each city to which they were dispersed. Not only that, the Russians were amateurs in dealing with Khazarians, while the Khazarians were experts in dealing with Christians. Centuries of Christian restrictions had taught them to hate all Christian governments. As a consequence, they were involved in every plot against the Tsar and his government. Every time an assassination took place or a bomb exploded, it was assumed that an Ashkenazic Jew was involved. The Russian solution to this turn of events was, as mentioned earlier, to force them out of the country. Millions left for America. The three waves of immigration to the U.S. are as follows. 1654 to 1840, Sephardic Jews, approximately 2,000. 1841 to 1880, German Ashkenazic. 1881 to 1920, Eastern European Ashkenazic. The handful of early Sephardic immigrants to America came mostly from Portuguese and Spanish Jews who went first to Portuguese or Spanish colonies in South and Central America and then came to the United States. The German wave was caused by German special taxes and quota laws enacted in the attempt to deal with the massive arrival of Polish Jews from the Kieliniki massacres in 1648, and then the German acquisition of Galicia from Poland in the late 1700s, which brought with it a large complement of Jews. Rosenblum also lists an additional factor, the failure of the liberal revolutions of 1830 and 1848.